Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. That was a wonderful introduction, very inspirational, Eric, and thanks for stalling for me, Skip. I appreciate you doing that for me. It's wonderful to be back in the city of my birth. I was a bit of a nomad. Actually, my parents were when I was growing up. I spent 6 months here in Little Rock. I was born at St. Vincent's Infirmary, I understand. My father worked in the Air Force at North Little Rock Air Force Base, part of the ICBM program, and then went on to work for the Boeing Airplane Company as they supported the Apollo program. So I kind of grew up around the space program, in the space program, with model rockets and posters on the wall, and it just became my passion from an early age. And I owe my parents a lot of credit for giving me that inspiration to dream, and then the ability to make those dreams come true. And that's one of the things that I think is so special about our country, is that little kids, and I see a lot of young people here today, have the ability to dream big, and then in the infrastructure of our country, we have the ability to then make those dreams come true. And so it's great to see the young kids here today, and I hope that you work really hard in school, especially in math and science, because that's the language of the future. If you want to compete, if you want to be a leader in the future, you need to really work hard in everything you do, but especially math and science. And that's how I was able to live out my boyhood dream of flying in space. And as Eric alluded, these are very exciting days that we have. Some challenges, of course, with our economy and other issues to deal with, but we are at the beginning days of commercial space flight. We're doing things bolder in space. The future looks very bright indeed. We're going to be returning to the moon, ultimately going to Mars, and places beyond. And so by the time you guys get out of school, maybe you'll be the first men and women to walk on Mars, and I think that'd be really, really exciting. What I'd like to do with you today is share with you my most recent space shuttle flight. It was STS-120. We launched from the Kennedy Space Center October 23rd of last year. It's an incredibly complicated, very ambitious mission to begin with, and it got a lot more complicated, and actually one of the most dramatic space shuttle missions in history as the mission unfolded. One of the toughest things a crew has to do is get together, get 7 people to agree on a patch design. Once you have that completed, you're ready to go fly. Seriously, this is tough stuff. The morning of launch, we're in our pumpkin suits, our orange launch and entry suits, and we get into this modified mobile home. We call it the Astrovan, and it has cooling and things there for us. We wave to our friends in the media, take a 3.5-mile ride out to the launch pad and do our STS-120 salute. It's a fist bump. You'll see that elsewhere in the movie. The orbiter's literally alive as we strap in. There's hydrogen and oxygen flowing through the main engines of the orbiter. Several people on the pad help us get strapped in, ready for the dynamics of launch. 6 seconds before the launch, the 3-man engines throttle up. Computers see that they're running properly, and then the solid rocket boosters, the white rockets, ignite, and you know you're leaving town in a hurry. It's really an incredible acceleration. Go from 1G to over 2.5 Gs almost instantaneously. By the time you're cleared the launch tower, you're already going 100 miles an hour. 8.5 minutes later, you're in space, 17,500 miles an hour. Just an incredible roller coaster ride, except that kind of sense of acceleration, but it's going on for 8.5 minutes. 3 times your normal body weight, it's pushing you against the wall. Kind of feels like a gorilla sitting on your chest. And you can see what the solid rocket booster separation looks like here from the crew compartment. These rockets will fall down into the ocean, be recovered via parachute, and used on a subsequent flight. Here we are at main engine cutoff. We'll get rid of this orange external tank. It's our gas tank. And we fly in formation with it for a few minutes and take pictures of it to make sure that we haven't sustained any damage on the launch, which is, of course, what happened during the Columbia tragedy back in 2003. On the next flight day, this is a computer animation, but we have to scan our thermal protection system, all the tiles and the wing leading edge, to make sure that we haven't sustained any major damage so that it's safe for us to come home at the end of our mission. Otherwise, we'd have to stay and live on the space station until another shuttle could come pick us up. You can see Pam waving out the overhead windows here as we do that fly by. The third flight day is very, very busy, very dynamic. It's our day of rendezvous with the space station. It's a game of catch-up from the very instant you launch. You're trying to meet a target that's going around the Earth at 17,500 miles an hour. So it's an incredible combination of computers and very smart folks in mission control, and even the pilot in the loop. This is an alignment system that Pam, our commander, used to physically fly the final phases of that rendezvous. About 600 feet below the space station, we do a big backflip to present the belly of the space shuttle to the crew on board the space station. They've got big bazooka telephoto lenses to make sure that we haven't taken any major dings on the belly of the orbiter. And here you're going to see the very final phases of Pam's close approach to the space station and final docking. It's an amazing city in the sky. 400,000 pounds worth of hardware up there, and the orbiter weighs 200,000 pounds. You're going to hear the final phases of the rendezvous here momentarily.
Discovery and Alpha, capture confirmed. And ISS is in free drift.
Houston copy.
Lots of fist bumps in our crew.
Discovery arrived.
So lots of celebration. Obviously, this is a major milestone. It's the beginning of our real work on the flight, of course. We're meeting all of our space station counterparts. This is Peggy Whitson, the commander of the space station. There were two female commanders on this flight, both on the space station and on the space shuttle, first time in history. I was the lead spacewalker on the flight. I'm doing a pre-breathe, kind of like deep sea diving. We have to get rid of nitrogen in our bodies before we go out into the vacuum of space. So we get into our spacesuits. It's a team effort. You're out in your own personal spacecraft as you're outside on a spacewalk. So everything has to be checked and double-checked. It's a very committing thing to send someone out into the vacuum of space. Here we are floating out of the hatch, an incredible view. Remember, I don't know if it was this spacewalk or another, but floating out just perfectly timed, and there were the Himalayas right below. Really dramatic. And of course, we work as a team in these operations. We're about to install a new module to the space station. So Dan Tani and Stephanie Wilson were flying the space station robotic arm, and we were transferring this large module. This is highly sped up. It doesn't move this quickly, trust me. But this weighs about 35,000 pounds, and we're very carefully maneuvering that into position, and then we're going to berth it to the space station where it now resides. On my last flight, the flight before this one, I actually installed the new robotic arm on the space station. We took it up on STS-100. This is a helmet camera seeing what I saw as I worked with some fluid connectors here, setting up for the second of our 4 spacewalks. This is the very first view into the new module that we called Harmony. It was also known as Node 2. All the international partner laboratory modules plug into this thing, kind of like Tinker Toys. And here you can see Paolo and Peggy dressed up in goggles and masks. They kind of look like bank robbers, but they actually did that just to make sure that the air was clean enough for the rest of us to go in. On the 6th flight day, then we went out on another spacewalk. Paolo was our quarterback inside, kind of guiding us through the procedures. Pam is here on the aft flight deck of the shuttle, also following along. And we went out to outfit the new module that we'd taken up. And then the big part of the spacewalk was preparing to move a very large solar array truss that we called P6. And here I am using a power tool to basically detach this 35,000-pound truss element. And the robotic arm is now lifting it off. It's about the size of a school bus, one of the orange school buses that you see on the street, being very carefully hoisted out. And then it's going to be, over the course of 2 days, put at the very tip of the space station, as far as you can go. We also did some inspections of what we call the solar array rotary joint. There's a bunch of debris here that's going to require some additional spacewalks in the future. You'll hear about that in the media in the next few days. We're about to launch another shuttle tomorrow evening, as a matter of fact, where they'll be going back to look at this area. And then we rest a couple of days, and then come out on a very big spacewalk, this one to install this P6 solar array truss. You can see it being positioned into place here at the very tip of the space station. Very poor visual cues for the robotic arm operators. So Doug Wheelock, my spacewalking partner, and I were actually the eyes and ears of the robotic arm operators, again, Dan and Stephanie, and we helped guide it precisely into place, into these cups. And then we took big power tools, kind of like your DeWalt at home, but obviously a little bit different because it has to go outside in the vacuum of space, and we bolted the two things together. And here we are. You can see the space shuttle here a very, very long way away. Very dramatic view back towards home. And then at the completion of the spacewalk, Doug got on the shuttle's robotic arm and transferred a big spare unit. And this is where the mission really got exciting. This was a very complicated mission up to this point, and we're having great success. This first solar array went out perfectly, but on the other side, we began to deploy an array. It was basically some laptop commands inside the spacecraft, and as it was deploying, a frayed guide wire ripped apart these panels. This is essentially a crisis for us because it wasn't safe for the shuttle to undock. We couldn't bring any future space shuttles back to the station until this was repaired. And if we were to jettison this solar array, there wouldn't be enough power to bring up the additional modules. So we had to fix this. So within the next 72 hours, brilliant men and women in Houston and around the country worked sleepless nights to develop a plan to, first of all, get me out to this very tip of the space station and then do surgery on it, essentially. So you can see Yuri, one of the cosmonauts that was up on the station, and Paolo, an Italian astronaut on our crew. They're basically taping up my spacesuit so that I won't receive any shock, because we're going to be working on a solar array that's got 100 volts coursing through its veins. This is a live solar array. I'm at the very end of a cobbled together robotic arm plus an inspection boom, about 90 feet in length. No one had ever thought to do this before, but I was the beneficiary of it because I had this incredible view. It was a God's eye view of planet Earth and, of course, the space station and the shuttle. No one had ever seen any from this perspective before. I was just an amazing 45-minute ride. They had to snake me through this other solar array panel that was closer to the airlock and get me around into a precise position. And then Doug and I had to work together to cut out this frayed guide wire in a very controlled way. And of course, anytime you would touch the solar array, it would move like a big sail. And didn't want it to touch me at all, so I had special tools to keep it away from me as it coursed back towards my body. And then the final steps were to install these devices we called cufflinks. I'm putting in one such cufflink there, and I have to stretch out the other end of it and put it on the other side of the tear. 5 of these in total. And I really wanted to have an extra set of hands up there to help me. I ultimately figured out a way to use 3 tools with just 2 hands. And once I figured out this technique, it worked out very nicely. And we're able to get all 5 of these cufflinks installed, and then ultimately deploy the array. And just a huge elation, not only for us out on the spacewalk, but for the entire NASA team. Many people have likened this to the space station, space shuttle era Apollo 13. When they figured out this plan, they dumped everything out on the table. What do they have on board? What can we go to use to fix this? And it worked just flawlessly. A real milestone for the folks in mission control and for NASA. So here you can see the solar array fully deployed. It's generating full power, and of course we've subsequently launched other missions to install these laboratory modules that I mentioned. This is really cool. I was able to just pull off with my fingertips and coast for like 30 feet without touching anything. One of the neatest experiences of the whole mission for me. So this spacewalk in particular, EVA-4, was 7 hours and 19 minutes, but it was a good day on the job for sure. We had a couple of visitors. We had the president of Italy join us for an event, and then Miss Barbara Bush, and she brought her husband along, which is nice. And then, of course, it's just a real joy to be up in space, and everywhere you go, you're flying like a Buzz Lightyear or Superman or whoever your favorite superhero is. But you can do flips and spins and just a real sense of freedom being up there. Here's Pam transferring some water. This is Peggy, our station commander, and Clay Anderson, who we brought home. He had been up on the space station for 5 months. Paul was doing an experiment, simulating throwing a ball, checking out reaction times and such. This is a ham radio pass with students on the ground, so educational outreach. And these are student-supported experiments that we also flew on the mission. So even though we're a big operations flight, we did do some science on the mission as well. Of course, as you're doing all these things, you're always positioned over the beautiful planet Earth, and every free moment that you had, you wanted to be by that window and just soak in the views. Not everything was so beautiful, though, especially when you thought in depth about what it represented. These are the fires of Southern California that were ongoing at the time of our flight. These are the Alps, very beautiful sight. Italy, Paolo's home, is down to the left, and then, of course, the rest of the European continent over here. This is a beautiful shot. This is looking straight down on the Himalayas. The mountains just kind of reach up and seem like you can touch them. It's a tradition at the end of a successful mission. The two commanders will then install the mission patch on a special wall in the space station. It's a very emotional time, especially for these two gentlemen right here. Dan, we'd trained with for about 1.5 years. We were leaving him to live on the space station for 5.5 months, and we're bringing Clay home after a very successful flight of the same duration, and so it was very hard for him to say goodbye to the station. And of course, another fist bump with spirit fingers here to seal the deal. And we kind of went our separate ways. We went off to the shuttle. They stayed on the station, closed the hatch, and then the following morning, again a team effort to get ready to undock. George Zamka, our Marine colonel, had the keys for the shuttle that day, and so he backed us out very gracefully. It's about 0.2 of a foot per second initially, and then he ramps it up. And what he's going to do is pull us out to about 400 to 600 feet away from the station, and then we're going to do a full lap around the space station and look at our handiwork. And as you can see, it's an enormous facility in the sky. Very dramatic. Very hard to say goodbye, but we had a great sense of accomplishment. I didn't point it out, but you could actually see the cufflink repair that we had done on an earlier sequence there. And then as the sun set on the space station, we had to reconfigure our spacecraft into a landing vehicle or a glider, because that's really what you are on landing day. You don't have engines to go around. You have to make it right the very first time. So it's very committing once you decide you're going to come home to land. So we closed the payload bay doors, get everybody into their pumpkin suits again. This is Pam getting ready for a big landing. She's a colonel in the Air Force. Stephanie Wilson was our flight engineer and also our prime robotic operator. And so you can see, watch right here, that's the deceleration from our deorbit burn as it's taking place. You can also see the orange glow as we start to interface with the upper reaches of the atmosphere. It's a fireball outside. It's 3,000 degrees, glowing hot as you come back home. Start to feel the G's again. You feel like a 100-year-old man as you're supporting not only your body weight, but your 70-pound spacesuit. You're really screaming by the Earth. This is out George Zamka's right-hand window. Those are the sonic booms heralding our return to the Kennedy Space Center. Relatively clear day, although here you can see through their heads-up display what it looked like. But there are a few patchy clouds, one right on short final, which is a little disconcerting for the front seaters. Here at about 4,000 feet. Thankfully, we pop right on through. There's the runway, and all is well. About 300 feet above the ground, we'll lower the landing gear. Coming down very steep, very fast. About 205 knots, we touch down. Then we'll deploy a drag chute to lessen the slap-down force on the nose gear. Here it comes. And thankfully home about an hour after landing. We get a chance to walk around the orbiter and thank all the people that had made our mission possible and also very, very safe. Here's Doug talking about fishing or something. I'm not sure exactly what he's talking about, but it was a great mission. So, so that was STS-120. I have one other thing that I'd be happy to share with you. It's kind of a blooper reel. You know, this is our professional presentation, but you know, it's also very, very fun to be in space. And there are a lot of young people here, so if you're interested, we could show you that. Would you guys like to see that? Okay, well, let's go ahead and show that. It doesn't need any narration from me. It's actually set to music, so I think you'll enjoy it. That's an orbital maneuvering system burn. We have like 1/6 G on the vehicle at that point. Towel with too much shampoo.
Zambo! Zambo!
Zambo is eating some delicious chocolate. He can't be bothered right now.
Zambo! Whale! Dude.
Alpha and Discovery Houston on air to ground 2. We're just a minute or so away from being ready.
We're hiding from President Bush.
You guys got me good. It is great to see y'all and look like you're having way too much fun.
That would be the STS-120 crew. Yes, we're always having too much fun.
Thank you for joining us on this flight. It was certainly the high point of my career. You know, I've flown 5 times. Another great moment for me was flying with one of my boyhood heroes, Senator John Glenn, on my 3rd flight. But the excitement on this mission, you know, topped it all. It was really incredible to not only go do this work, but it also reflects on the people that I flew with. It was just an amazing flight crew to be a part of. So glad you enjoyed that. I'd be happy to take questions from folks in the time that we have remaining.
If you're stationary in the center of the room, if you're stationary in the center of the room in air, can you use the air to move yourself?
Great question. Yeah. Did everyone hear the question? I don't think that was loud enough, perhaps. But the question was, if you were in the center of this room, for example, if we're all in space right now and you're positioned right up there, you'd be in a world of hurt. It would take you a very long time to actually use the air in the volume to propel yourself around to kind of swim through it because the density is so low. But it's actually kind of fun because you can use momentum. You know, if you look at the Olympic divers, for example, they can, you know, twist and turn and flip in very efficient, beautiful ways. And those same kinds of things you can do even easier up in space because there's, you know, with the lack of gravity. So everybody becomes a gymnast when you're up in space, which is really fun. I'm sorry? 5 pounds pressure? No, internal to the spacecraft, it's typically 14.7 pounds PSI, so it's 1 atmosphere inside the spacecraft. But then when we go outside on a spacewalk, our suit is pressurized to 4.3 PSI, and we're breathing 100% oxygen when we do that. Did that answer your question? No, we breathe 100% oxygen. If we, no, 4.3 psi. Yeah, yeah. You want to take the microphone?
All right.
I know that you do exercises and things up there, but like you up there for 15 days and the other folks up there for 5 months, how difficult is it to kind of reacclimate to gravity when you're back?
Great question. Even on a very short space flight, if you were to do nothing, if you were to fly in space for 3 or 4 days and you did no exercise whatsoever, you would lose a considerable amount of your bone calcium, especially in the like your femur and your spine, areas that support your body weight. And so we discovered early on that exercise is very important. So loading of those bones and muscles. When you go into space, it's almost like being bedridden. It's like being post-op. If you just had surgery and you're in bed, your body gets deconditioned. And so unless you do something about that, you'd have a very difficult time on landing. And that, of course, is a very critical phase of the flight. If something were to go wrong on landing, you want to have the physical ability to get away from the shuttle after the landing. So every day, crew members will exercise. Even on a shuttle flight, we'll get on a bike ergometer and keep our cardiovascular system healthy. If you're going to be up on the space station for 5 or more months, you'll spend 2 hours a day exercising. And a lot of that involves resistive exercise, loading up the body. Very important.
I think later in the space shuttle program, you developed a way to repair the heat tiles.
Yes.
Could you comment on, it seems like there's a great deal of reluctance to actually use that. I know that may be kind of a foolish question, but could you comment on the reasons why there's so much concern about actually deploying that? Is it because it's never been tried, or could you just comment on that?
Well, you lucked out. You got the right guy to ask, because I was the lead crew member on the team that developed those technologies. And so, yes, if a space shuttle were to be hit again, similar to what happened during Columbia, that would probably be beyond our capabilities, and we would have to go to crew rescue. We would send up another shuttle and bring the crew down on a different vehicle. But if smaller damage were to be sustained, we actually have a very fancy caulk gun that can deploy some material that would actually withstand the heat and protect the heat shield of the shuttle. The problem is, anytime you go around the thermal protection system of the shuttle, it's a risk of making things worse. The material is very chalky, and so if you were to just put your finger firmly on the surface of the tile, you would crunch right through it. And of course, we're out in a big, bulky pressure suit with tools and things dangling off of us and tethers, and so you have to be very, very sure that you want to go out and make a repair. And so, thankfully, we have very smart people that work at NASA, some of America's best and brightest, and they have analytical tools that can tell us, is this damage site of enough concern that we really need to go and take that risk? And there was a mission, actually the flight right before I flew, it was called STS-118, where it was a tough call. The mission control team had to decide whether or not to go repair this damage site. It was no more than this in size, very tiny little ding that had been sustained. But it was in a place on the vehicle that it wasn't that critical, it wasn't that deep, and they elected not to do the repair. So you have to weigh those risks before doing it.
We'll go to this gentleman right over here. But I would like to encourage some of the younger folks in the crowd, if you have a question, feel free. We'll get to you next.
They're going back to the old Apollo style vehicles. What are they going to do about the cargo bay and things like that? I don't see how that's going to work the way the space shuttle does.
You're right. The space shuttle was a brilliant invention. There's no vehicle like it in the works that can do all the workhorse kinds of things that it did. Deliver satellites and modules and large payloads to orbit. Right now, the way that's going to happen is with expendable boosters. So anything large in nature will have to go up independently. There is in the new Orion program, it's called, a small payload bay where we could take up some very small payloads, small-sized satellites or equipment to repair the space station, but nothing that the shuttle can do. So.
Why do you use 100% oxygen?
Well, when we go outside on a spacewalk, it's kind of like going deep-sea diving. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the bends, but what happens to divers if they go too deep and stay too long? In the air that we breathe, it's some oxygen and a lot of nitrogen. And what happens to nitrogen when you go diving? And also, it can happen if you go on a spacewalk and don't follow the rules. The nitrogen in your blood can actually kind of bubble up, and it can get out into your joints and give you joint pain. And on a really bad day, if you had a lot of nitrogen come out of your bloodstream, it could actually form these huge bubbles in your bloodstream and give you a heart attack or maybe even a stroke. So we have to be very careful to get rid of the nitrogen in our system before we go out on a spacewalk. And then to limit the nitrogen in our system, also we breathe 100% oxygen. So that's a good question.
One all the way in the back.
Well, first of all, thank you for being here. This has been very interesting.
Great.
We like to watch a lot of shows on space programs, and we recently watched one, and it talked about some of the risks and the dangers with current space programs and with possible future programs. One of the things that I thought was very interesting was the risk of punctures or tears in your spacesuit if you do a lot of spacewalking. Mm-hmm. Is that something that is always on your mind, or are you just so busy thinking about other things you're not concerned about that?
Thankfully, we're too busy to think about that, but if you really did stop and dwell on that, you would be very concerned. It's really amazing to look at the scatter plots. The Air Force tracks space debris, space junk, and they can only get down to a couple inches in size. And of course, there are very few really large pieces, and then as you get smaller and smaller, there are exponentially more and more pieces. So, below that threshold of detection, there are all sorts of, millions upon millions of very small fragments that are in orbit. They're traveling very, very fast, hypervelocity. They're 17,500 miles plus, and you just can't predict when and where they're going to hit you. We track, I believe, on the order of 7,000 to 9,000 pieces of space debris in orbit now. And of course, as we continue to launch things come off of boosters and fairings and errant satellites, clutter the skies, from geosynchronous orbit all the way down to even below the space station, where the spy satellites and things like to live. So it's a very dangerous environment. We have obviously sustained small damage, even on the shuttle. A spacewalking crew member has never been hit, thankfully. But on this last mission, we did take a ding to one of our overhead windows, and then also to one of the window frames right near our commander's window. So there's a lot of debris up there, and it's just a matter of time that something critical could get damaged. So it's very important as more and more countries join the space business that we take better care of low Earth orbit. And already there's some talk of trying to limit what happens in lunar orbit. We're trying to keep the lunar orbit free of that kind of risk, because thankfully here on Earth, when things do come careening down, they typically burn up in the Earth's atmosphere. But if you're, for example, an astronaut on a lunar base, if something were to deorbit, it's going to come down intact, and it could do much more damage.
This gentleman right here in the middle.
Recently, I think in the last few months, the Japanese Space Agency has outlined plans for a really big commitment to the space elevator. And that commitment's pretty large compared to what we've done as far as infusing prize money. I was curious, I could have your opinion on how viable that will be once the nanotechnology is sufficient.
Well, to explain for folks, space elevator is essentially a long tether based on the ground, but then extending up to an anchor, if you will, in geosynchronous orbit, so that you can actually use this tether to work your way up, work large payloads up to orbit. And so it's a very exciting concept, incredibly difficult technically to scale up something like that and then assemble it to those kinds of altitudes. So it's very exciting to make investments in that space and to develop the enabling technologies to make that possible. But I think it's certainly decades away. I would love to see it happen, and it would be a very efficient and effective way to get things to orbit. But the path from here to realization is going to be a tough one, I think. Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
There's this young lady right here.
How long is the runway when the shuttle comes down, and how far does the shuttle travel on when coming back from landing?
Oh, great question. Well, I'll answer the second part first. We perform our deorbit burn half a world away. So we're on the other side of the Earth. When we turn the shuttle around, so the tail is pointing in the direction that we're traveling, and we have engines back there that slow us down. And we're traveling at, Mach 25 times the speed of sound. But we only need to slow down just a little bit. And so we fired these engines for a couple minutes. It slows us down just enough to get us into the upper reaches of the atmosphere. We start to interface with the Earth's atmosphere about 4,000 miles away from the Kennedy Space Center. So, a little bit west of the continental United States is where we start to drop down below 400,000 feet, and that's when the orange fireball starts to happen. And it's really amazing when you look out the window at that point because, when you're up in orbit and traveling at, 5 miles a second over the Earth, it still looks, it's very impressive and looks very fast, but when you're low down and traveling at those speeds, there's a kind of a ground rush sensation. And I remember one time on the flight deck, I was the flight engineer, looking out the pilot's window. We did a right bank over Baja, California, and I saw it there, and I looked over to reach a switch or something, and I looked back, and we were already over Mexico. And that's just how quickly it happened. So you're thinking, I hope we can slow down in time to hit Florida. So the impressive sense of speed. As you come down for landing, we hit Mach 1 or 1 times the speed of sound. And then the commander will take over manually flying and flies a big heading alignment circle to line up precisely with the runway. We come down at a 20-degree glide slope, very, very steep, about 5 or 6 times steeper than a commercial airliner or a fighter jet will do, and much faster. We come down at about 300 knots. So we're screaming down on a dive bomb run. About 2,000 feet above the ground, we pitch up the nose. Then 300 feet above the ground, we lower the gear, as I said in the film. And then the runway is 3 miles long. It's 15,000 feet and very wide. It's about twice the normal width of a typical runway. We can land on other runways around the world. We have emergency landing sites all over the world, but we like to land either at Edwards Air Force Base, which has a lot of different places for us to land, or at the Kennedy Space Center. So it's a fun way to come home.
This gentleman hasn't asked one yet.
Thank you. Given the annual recurring budgetary constraints of the federal government, can you give us a sense of the return on the investment in the space program as an argument, because we've got to compete with a lot of other needs out there?
Thank you for asking that. Yeah, and I always like to touch on this because this is probably going to surprise you, much of what I'll say. Many people think that our budget is analogous to the Department of Defense or healthcare or one of these large programs. We're one of the smallest line items on the federal budget. We're 0.6% of our budget. I was just describing this at lunch. You probably spend more on pizza every year than you do on NASA. Not even 1% of the budget goes to us. It's a very small fraction, and then a fraction of our budget goes to aeronautics, of course, and deep space probes, and then a portion goes to human spaceflight, of course. But we're a very small budget, but what we do is visionary. It creates new industries, new technologies, new discoveries. We don't know exactly what we're going to find, but if history is any lesson, We've made incredible advances in miniaturization computers, new materials. So if you were to go into any intensive care unit and look on the wall at the monitors that are there, that's a derivative of your space program. Computer technology, the things inside the box, a lot of that comes from what we do. The gear that firefighters wear, and the protective clothing, the oxygen systems that they use, so many things that touch our lives come from the space program. And so I think it's really important, even in these lean financial times, that we continue to do things that invest in our future. If we are to retract now, it's going to have horrible impacts down the road in terms of our competitiveness as a nation, jobs for our kids. We want good jobs, high-paying, jobs that are going to take us places, and so that's what NASA does for us. And then, there are certainly the intangibles of, the inspiration that it provides all of us, looking out and finding our place in the universe and such. So I think we have a president-elect who sees it that way, and I know that he's going to have to look in every corner to find nickels and dimes, but hopefully we won't get hurt too bad.
We have time for one more question, and we're going to end on one of these gentlemen right here in the middle.
Who's up first?
Do you have any way to steer, or do you just have to get the shuttle exactly on the runway as soon as you get into the atmosphere?
In space, we have rocket jets, thrusters that we call them, that can point the shuttle in any direction that we want. And then as we come into the Earth's atmosphere, there's air outside, more and more dense air as the lower we get. So we can use, have you ever seen ailerons or rudders on an airplane? So those same kinds of control surfaces then take over, and we can use those to point the shuttle, pitch up the nose, lower the nose, yaw it, roll it, whatever we need to do to line up to the runway. And that's exactly what the commander does. Pam had a control stick just like in a jet, and she could line it up very precisely, and that's why she did such a great job on the landing.